The headlights tore across the dark fields like wild animals, and the scream of tires ripping through my crops made my stomach clench tighter than any fist I had ever known. Each time she did it, my heart hammered like a drum of rage, but this night it felt different. I could smell the sharp tang of crushed stalks and damp soil mingling with exhaust, and in that moment I realized this was no careless mistake. It was deliberate. She wanted me to watch her destroy what I built. I had worked these fields every dawn and every dusk for years. Every row of corn was planted by hand and watered by sweat. This land was more than soil. It was history. It was survival. But to Kerren it was nothing but an obstacle between her driveway and the main road. She was a queen of the homeowners association, and she carried that title like a weapon. Her manicured nails and sharp smile promised one thing. If she wanted something, she would take it. The first time I saw her car carving through the crops, I thought it was a fluke. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was drunk. I confronted her politely on the street the next morning. She looked me in the eye and said with a smirk, "Your field is just dirt with weeds." I did not hurt anything worth keeping. That was the moment I knew I was dealing with arrogance coated in perfume. I went to the HOA meeting hoping for sanity, hoping for fairness. I explained the damage. I asked for boundaries to be respected. Kerren sat at the head of the table, tapping her pen against her notepad like a judge ready to declare sentence. She leaned forward and announced, "Maybe if you maintain your property, it would not look so inviting to cut across." Laughter followed from her allies while my blood simmered under my skin. The authorities gave me no comfort. I called. I reported trespass and destruction. They shrugged and said it was a civil matter. I hung up with the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. I realized that in their eyes, a farmer losing crops was not an emergency. But for me, every stalk crushed was money lost. Every patch of ruined earth was time erased. Kerren grew bolder with each silent response from those meant to help me. She timed her shortcuts so I would see her. She slowed her car down just enough to roll her window down and wave, a mocking little flick of her hand, as if she were royalty acknowledging a peasant. The crunch of tires on roots became my alarm clock. The smear of mud across her tires became her badge of triumph. Neighbors whispered. Some pitied me. Others feared her power in the association and stayed silent. She thrived on that silence. Each meeting she reminded us of fines for grass too long, paint too chipped, shutters the wrong shade of white. Yet when I raised my hand and spoke of her destruction, she cut me off with a smile that could slice steel. "You are lucky I am not filing against you for lowering property values." There are moments in life when you realize logic has no place, when you see that reason bounces off entitlement like raindrops on glass. I had reached that point. I stood in my field one morning staring at the jagged scars of tire tracks carving through my crops like wounds. I inhaled the bitter scent of broken stalks and knew this was not negligence. It was war declared under guise of neighborhood order. Still, I tried to keep peace. I patched the soil. I replanted. I told myself persistence was stronger than pettiness. But every repair was mocked by another drive-through. Every harvest was stained by the memory of headlights. And the image of Kerren grinning behind her will haunted me like a cruel ghost. The breaking point came not from her words, but from the hollow silence of watching authority and neighbors alike fold their arms and look away. They would not stop her. They would not even speak against her. That meant the burden fell squarely on me, and I was done being crushed like the rows of corn beneath her tires. That night, I stood in the field again. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of soil. My fists curled into dirt, and my chest burned with a truth I could no longer ignore. She thought she was untouchable. She thought her car could carve a kingdom across my land, and no one would challenge her reign. But she had mistaken my patience for weakness. She had mistaken my silence for surrender. And she had forgotten one simple fact. I know this land better than anyone, and it was about to fight back with me. The night she carved her tires through the earth for the 5th time, I stood at the edge of the field with my breath cold in my chest, and I knew that patching soil and pleading with meetings would no longer matter. Every broken stalk glistened under the moonlight like shattered glass, and the smell of damp earth mixed with gasoline filled my lungs until it made me sick. Kerren had crossed the line one too many times, and the weight of my silence had turned into fire. I did not want anger to consume me. I wanted precision. When dawn came, I walked the field and studied the tracks like a hunter studying prey. The ground dipped slightly near the eastern row, where water often collected. I crouched low and pressed my palm into the soil. It gave under my hand, soft, pliable, eager to betray her arrogance. That was when the seed of the plan rooted itself in me. If she loved to cut through my land with her car, then I would let her, but on my terms. She would not escape with a mocking wave this time. She would sink into the very earth she had mocked. The following days I moved like a shadow. No one saw me working because I chose the hours when lights were off and curtains were drawn. I dug with steady strokes of the shovel until sweat blinded my eyes and blisters cracked open on my palms. The soil smelled of iron and rain, and each clump tossed aside felt like a step toward justice. I carved out a basin deep enough to swallow her tires whole, lined it with soaked earth, and fed water into it from a concealed pipe. Then I covered it with straw and a thin layer of soil until it looked no different than the rest of the field. To the eye it was solid. To her arrogance it was a perfect snare. As I worked, I thought of her face at the meetings, the curl of her lip as she mocked, the way her voice carried through the room as though she spoke with divine authority. I thought of her waving hand as she rolled through the crops, and I imagined the moment that hand would clutch the steering wheel in panic when the ground betrayed her. The vision drove me harder than any whip could. Yet with every stroke of the shovel came doubt. What if she never drove that way again? What if she suspected something? What if my effort went unseen, and I stood waiting for justice that would never arrive? But then I remembered her pride. She could not resist a shortcut. She could not resist proving she could do what she pleased. She thrived on a performance of rebellion cloaked as authority. Pride would bring her to me. When the trap was finished, I stood at the edge and stared at it under the dim light of dawn. The air smelled of wet clay and my body ached with exhaustion, but my mind was sharp. I whispered to the soil itself, "Hold her when she comes," and I covered the last traces of my labor. Kerren grew quiet too. For several days she did not cut across, and I wondered if the silence was strategy. Was she toying with me, or was it simply chance? The unease gnawed at me like hunger, and I found myself restless, pacing the property, glancing toward the road. One evening as the sun bled orange into the horizon, I heard it. The familiar growl of her engine approaching, steady, arrogant, unhurried. My breath caught in my throat as the headlights swung wide and poured across the crops. She had returned. The crunch of her tires on stalks echoed like bone snapping. She was drawing closer to the eastern row, where the ground waited like a mouth ready to swallow. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The smell of gasoline drifted on the wind, and every sense sharpened. She drove with her usual arrogance, window down, one hand resting lazily as though this was her land, not mine. The tires bumped over the field, closer, closer, until the ground itself seemed to hold its breath with me. And then I heard the sound I had been waiting for. A heavy thud followed by the desperate screech of tires spinning against wet earth. Mud splashed upward, catching the glow of headlights, and her car lurched violently before sinking deeper. Her scream sliced through the evening air as the field finally claimed its toll. The scream that tore from her throat was raw and jagged, and for a moment it seemed to silence the night itself. Her tires spun furiously, sending clumps of mud shooting skyward in frantic arcs, the headlights cutting the haze and painting the air with streaks of pale gold. I stood at the edge of the field with my arms folded, my chest steady, my eyes fixed on the sight I had imagined for so long. Kerren was trapped, not just in the earth, but in her own arrogance, and no smile or wave could save her now. She slammed her car door open and stepped out, her expensive shoes sinking instantly into the muck. She cursed, flailed, tried to pull herself free, but every step dragged her deeper into the mire. Her perfume could not mask the sour stench of churned soil and gasoline. The sight was almost surreal. The queen of the neighborhood, reduced to a figure clawing at the mud like a desperate child. She spotted me in the shadows and shrieked, "You did this. You will pay for this." Her voice cracked with fury and fear, the two emotions colliding in a way that stripped her of the power she once wielded so casually. I did not answer at first. I let silence weigh on her as the mud pulled at her car and her dignity. Finally, I said, I did nothing but let the land defend itself. You brought this on yourself. The words carried across the field with calm finality, and I could see in her eyes that they struck harder than any shout. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the noise, their phones already raised, screens glowing like fireflies in the dusk. The spectacle unfolded before them as Kerren screamed and slipped and waved her arms wildly. She demanded help, but no one moved. Instead, they filmed, their laughter thin and sharp as it pierced the air. The HOA loyalists who once laughed at her jokes now had smirks behind their hands. The very audience she craved had turned against her. Her car groaned as the mud consumed its tires deeper, the engine whining like a wounded animal. She called the tow company on her phone, her voice high and shrill, and even that became part of the recording. I could already see the captions that would accompany the video online. The mighty Kerren of the HOA brought low by her own shortcuts. The tow truck arrived with its lights spinning and its driver smirking. He waded into the mess with slow, deliberate movements, his boots squelching in the mire. Kerren barked orders at him, but he ignored her tone, hooking the chain with professional detachment. Each clang of the metal chain echoed like a verdict being read aloud. When the truck hauled the car free, its once gleaming exterior was coated in a thick layer of mud that dripped in slow trails. It looked less like a luxury vehicle and more like a carcass dragged from a swamp. The neighbors clapped as if the performance had ended. Kerren tried to glare them into silence, but her face was flushed and streaked, her hair tangled, her clothes stained. She turned her fury back toward me, her finger trembling as she pointed. This is not over. I will bring charges. I will ruin you. But her words held no weight. They fluttered in the air like broken feathers, powerless against the chorus of laughter and a glow of countless recording devices. The HOA held an emergency meeting the next evening. Kerren did not sit at the head of the table. She sat in the corner, her eyes downcast, her voice absent. The other members shifted uncomfortably, pretending loyalty but secretly savoring her fall. The fines they once threatened me would vanish from the agenda. No one dared mention them. Instead, the meeting passed in awkward silence, as though everyone knew a kingdom had collapsed and its queen had been dethroned by her own hubris. In the days that followed, the video spread across the town and beyond. Memes painted her as a cartoon sinking into endless mud. Jokes whispered at grocery stores. Children giggling when they passed her house. She stopped driving across the field, stopped waving, stopped smiling her sharp smile. She walked with her head down, shoulders heavy, the crown of the HOA now a weight she could no longer bear. I returned to my field with renewed peace. The soil smelled of life again, no longer tainted by the roar of her engine. My crops grew steady and green, each row standing tall, unbroken. As I walked among them, I felt the satisfaction, not of cruelty, but of balance restored. She had learned that arrogance has a cost. The land had taught her the lesson that no meeting, no title, no smirk could erase. One evening I paused at the edge of the trap, now filled and leveled, the earth smooth once more. The memory of her panic lingered like a shadow, and I whispered to myself, she thought she could run me down, but in the end she was a one swallowed. The words tasted of victory, quiet and lasting. Justice had not come from courts or councils. It had come from patience, from wit, from the ground beneath my feet. Kerren had fallen, and I had risen not through rage but through resolve. And in the silence of the field I smiled, knowing the story was far from forgotten. The story should have ended with her car dragged from the mud, and her pride shattered, yet fate rarely allows arrogance to fade so easily. Kerren had tasted humiliation, but not defeat in her mind, and that made her dangerous still. I knew she would not forgive nor forget, and in the silence that followed her downfall, I could feel her anger simmering like coals hidden beneath ash. She was not a woman who accepted loss. She was a woman who reinvented herself to strike again. It began with whispers through the neighborhood. Neighbors mentioned strange comments from Kerren about lawsuits and revenge. She spoke of me as though I were a villain who had set a trap out of cruelty rather than defense. She painted herself as a victim, her voice heavy with false tremors as she told anyone who would listen that I had endangered her life. Some pitied her, some rolled their eyes. But I knew the danger was not in her words alone. It was in her need to regain control. One evening, I saw her car drive slowly by the edge of my property. The same car once pulled from the mud, now clean to a shine. Those streaks of earth still clung beneath the chassis like scars. She stopped, rolled down her window, and met my eyes. She said nothing, only smiled, but the smile was different. It was not mocking. It was promising. Promising that she had not forgotten. Promising that she would strike again. The following week, the HOA summoned me. The room was tense with expectation. Kerren sat ahead once more, shoulders squared, her crown reclaimed. She spoke of safety hazards, of liability, of community standards. She accused me of digging traps that could have harmed children or pets. Her words slithered like serpents, carefully chosen, designed to twist perception. The room shifted uneasily, but I stood calm. I explained with clarity that my field had been violated, that I had repaired damage, that the soil had simply been soft from irrigation. I did not raise my voice. I did not falter. I let the truth sit heavy while her lies wavered in the air. But she was relentless. She presented papers, legal threats, claims of negligence. She sought to drown me not in mud, but in bureaucracy. And for a moment, I wondered if perhaps this was how she would finally win. Not with speed or arrogance, but with endless paper and ink. Yet then I remembered what had always been her weakness. Pride. She could not resist proving herself superior. She could not resist taking one step too far. I laid my own evidence before them. Photographs of her car in the field. Video clips from neighbors who had recorded her trespass long before the trap was sprung. Statements from those who had seen her wave as she crushed my crops. Each piece was like a stone dropped into the water, and soon the ripples became a tide she could not withstand. Her face tightened. Her hands trembled. The smugness drained as quickly as the mud had swallowed her tires. The climax came when one neighbor played the recording from the night of her downfall, her voice screaming, her threats shrill, her accusations wild. The room erupted with laughter and shock, and in that instant the mask she wore crumbled completely. She slammed her hand against the table and shouted, "You will regret this, all of you." But the room no longer feared her. The tide had turned. She was stripped of her authority not by vote, but by collective scorn. She stormed out, her heels striking the floor like hammer blows, and the door slammed shut behind her. Silence lingered, broken only by the sound of muffled chuckles. One member finally spoke, declaring that the association would not pursue her claims. Another suggested she step down. The motion passed without resistance. Kerren had not just lost her power, she had lost her kingdom. When I walked home that night, the air felt lighter, the stars brighter. The soil beneath my boots no longer carried the weight of her trespass. I knew she would remain in the neighborhood, but without her throne, she was just another resident, stripped of authority, stripped of fear. And though she might glare from behind curtains or whisper from across fences, she could no longer harm me. As I stood in the quiet of my field, I breathed deeply the scent of crops growing tall and unbroken. I thought of the long road from silence to resistance, and of the moment when justice had risen not from anger alone, but from patience and proof. Kerren had tried to run me down, but in the end it was her pride that was crushed. The land had taught her once, and the people had finished the lesson. I whispered to the night. She thought she could bury me, but she buried herself, and the words rolled across the field like a promise sealed in earth and stone. The story was not just mine anymore. It belonged to every neighbor who had seen the fall of arrogance and the rise of justice. It belonged to anyone who ever felt powerless beneath the weight of entitlement. And its ending was carved not in paper or ink, but in mud and memory forever.